Welcome to episode 4 of the Chris Craft Show. I am so thankful for the response that the show has been receiving so far. So I encourage you to engage with me on Twitter at Craft Rights, and for sure subscribe, review, and rate on iTunes. You can listen on Stitcher and Google Play as well. And you can always find back episodes at chriscraftshow.com. You're going to love today's show. I'm speaking with a really sharp fellow, Pastor C.R. Wiley. He's in Connecticut. He's an excellent writer, and he loves the Lord. So let's get into today's show. Today on the Chris Craft Show, we're speaking with Pastor C.R. Wiley. This brother has a great story. He's a husband, father of 3, pastor at Presbyterian Church of Manchester, an author, and a real estate investor. Whew. He has written for Touchstone Magazine, Modern Reformation, Sacred Architecture, The Imaginative Conservative, Front Porch Republic, and other publications. He's the author of Man of the House, a handbook for building a shelter that will last in a world that is falling apart, and other titles as well. Wow, that's a mouthful. Welcome to the show, brother. How are you?
I'm fine, Chris. It's great to be with you. And by the way, you can just call me Chris, too. That's my first name.
Well, you have a good name. Good name. Sounds good.
All right.
So we always like to start with stories. So let's begin there. Take us as far back as you want, and please walk us through your life story.
Well, I'm glad to do it. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. My folks were, I guess, nominal Episcopalians, you could say. And the joke with Episcopalians is whether high or low, the status is always quo. And they kind of lived that out. I mean, my father was an academic. My mother was something of an artist, more of an art, lover who introduced me to the arts as a kid. Mm-hmm. And my father, though, was a seeker, but he was what I call ABC, anything but Christianity. And this was like the 60s, early 70s. So he got into different stuff. He got into the Baha'is. He got into kind of Unitarian Universalism a little bit. But he ended up in Scientology. And so I grew up in the Church of Scientology. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's the group that, includes people like John Travolta. Yes. And other Hollywood types. And if everything bad you've heard about it is true, it's a pretty creepy outfit. So he deserted us when I was about 11, and my sister and my mother and I lived in public housing. My mother was in and out of mental institutions after that, and I spent some time in foster care. So I skipped a lot of school. I hated the 8th grade so much I took it twice, I say. So that was kind of the world that I knew. It was pretty bleak, and so in the middle of all of that, I was befriended by a preacher's kid, and we became best friends. And because he went to church, I went to church. I didn't go to church because I wanted to. I just went there because my best friend had to go.
Right.
Over the course of time, I heard the gospel and came to believe it. And not long after that, I, came to see that I was called to the ministry. I didn't want to do it, though. I had other plans. I had, like I mentioned, my mother loved the arts, and when I showed some promise as a kid, I was, she sent me to art school. So I spent time in and out of art schools over the course of my childhood and teen years.
Oh, okay.
And had aspirations to be a comic book artist and go to New York and, do that whole Marvel scene, that kind of thing. And it was really a live option. I was pretty good. But it was because I wanted to do that I resisted the call of the ministry, struggled with it for a long time, and then finally was wrestled to the ground by the Lord, and I gave up. And because of that, I actually threw away all my stuff. I had hundreds of dollars worth of books and my art table and all that kind of thing. And I just felt like I needed to turn away from. No one made me do it or anything. I just thought that I loved that stuff too much. It was too much of a distraction, kind of an idol. So the cool thing is I've kind of been 30 years plus later, I've been picking it up again, and I'm actually working on a children's book that my agent is working to sell, and I'm doing the illustrations for it. So
wow, it's really cool.
It's coming back, and I'm happy for that. But that kind of gives you a little bit of the background on my childhood and teen years and stuff.
Really neat. And so let's rewind a little bit. What is it about the quote-unquote Church of Scientology that it seems like the people who partake in that system, there's always a break or a separation from family. What is that about?
Well, it's I think it's due to a couple different things. One is it's really a Gnostic heresy with a kind of science fiction twist. And if you are familiar with Gnosticism, it basically is the idea that the spirit and the body are so distinct from one another that really there's hardly any connection except a negative one. Like the ancient Gnostics believed that matter is evil, that the spirit is good.
Right. That's
and
right.
They didn't recognize that our material world was made by the same creator who made our spirits. They thought that there were two different creators. And so the Gnostics believe that our spirits are kind of trapped in our bodies, kind of like when you go out and you catch like a firefly at night with a mayonnaise jar, and you're trapped in your body, and the only way to be free is to escape it. Well, that's kind of the way that Scientologists think about things, but they believe in reincarnation, and they believe that our bodies are more or less just kind of like clothes that you put on and take off over time. Do you remember that movie? It was kind of a comedy called Look Who's Talking. It was like it's like this baby, and John Travolta was in it with Karen Black. And by the way, she's a Scientologist too.
Oh.
And this baby's like, you can get into the baby's head as they're doing all the stuff that you do with a baby, like goo goo gaga stuff. And the baby's got like this very mature sort of take, almost cynical take on what the parents are doing. And it's meant to be funny, but it's also kind of a revelation with regard to how Scientologists think about children and people in general.
Oh my goodness.
So Scientologists don't really think about their children in the same way that other people do. They more or less think of them as sort of like independent of them. And so it makes it easier for a Scientologist to kind of understand himself or herself without, the roles that regular people think about themselves, like as a father or a son or something like that. So that's part of it. And then the other thing is that Scientology is very expensive. You may have heard that, they require tremendous a tremendous deal from the people who practice it, and to sort of advance in Scientology costs tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Wow.
So it generally bankrupts households and destroys homes for that reason too.
Wow. And I hate to stay on scars in life, but this is really interesting. That is your father. Is he still alive? Is he still involved with that? And does he know where you are in your walk with Christ?
Yeah. The answer is yes to all those things. He's still in Scientology. Yep. He lives in Florida. We're not interacting. That's kind of a long story, and it's primarily my doing. But yeah, he's still alive, and he's still involved with those guys.
Wow. So you're a busy guy. Like I said, your intro was a mouthful, and I really like that. I'm a writer myself, so I respect all the work that goes into your craft. But how do you manage it all as a husband, a pastor, an author, a blogger, a landlord, and an investor? That's a lot to juggle. How do you do it all? By God's grace, of course.
Right. Yeah. But and I don't do it all at once.
Sure.
And things kind of feed on each other too. I've got a very for one thing, my kids are all grown now, right. And so the demands that, a younger father deals with, I'm not dealing with. And then I've got a very understanding church. When they called me, knew what they were getting, and they encouraged me to write. And they're not even all that impressed with it, to be honest with you. I've got a book coming out in a couple of weeks, and it's kind of a yawner for them. But that's actually good, because what I do for them as a pastor is only kind of tangentially related to what I'm, doing as a writer.
Yeah.
But the things too kind of build on each other. So on a practical level, mornings are when I do my creative work. So there was a great book. It came out not too long ago. I think you might enjoy, called Daily Rituals.
Okay.
That looks at like 300 different artists and thinkers and scientists and stuff, and looks at what their daily routine was like. So like Beethoven, he'd go in and tell you exactly what Beethoven did at, what time he got up, what he had to drink. He drank like coffee like crazy. By the way, that's what a lot of them did. but Beethoven was kind of obsessive. He would count out the beans for every cup, so it was 60 beans per cup, and then he'd grind them. It was like a ritual he performed. But anyway, so I had my mornings are set aside for writing and for that kind of stuff, and then my afternoons I spend doing administrative work, and then for the church, and counseling and that kind of stuff.
Sure.
And the evenings and so forth. And then, when it comes to the real estate, that's, sometimes it's on and off. So when everything's going great, it's hardly anything to do. But when things are, in transition, like right now, I'm working on an apartment, getting it ready for rent. And
cool.
So I do a lot of that myself because I've actually got a background in construction. So that actually is kind of a problem because it's hard to hire people to do stuff when you know how to do it yourself.
Sure. Oh, I know it all too well.
So it's a blessing and a curse. But anyway, that's kind of how it works. And I've got a very understanding wife, and like I said, my kids are grown and they're pretty much into their own things. I mean, they're all artists themselves and are completely into their own stuff. So.
Well, they get it honest. Are they in the Connecticut area or in the tri-state area?
Well, my oldest son and his wife live in Houston.
Oh, that's where I'm from, born and raised. Cool.
Oh, neat. All right. Well, they're down in Baytown. She comes from there, and her folks own a furniture or a flooring company. So they asked my son to come and help out with all the repairs from the hurricane. So he's down there, but he's a musician and a producer, does a lot of video, audio stuff. And so I think they'll probably end up in Nashville someday. But then my second born is another son, and he's a welder and a metal fabricator and a blacksmith, and he's always working on stuff with his smith and smithy and stuff.
Cool.
And then my daughter is kind of like the literary academic type. So she's working in a coffee shop right now, kind of the stereotypical thing to do.
Right.
She's getting ready to she's taking a gap year, so she graduated from high school, but she's able to drive herself to work and take care of all of her own stuff. And she's also into all sorts of crafts and art and stuff. So
really, really neat. Really neat. And obviously your wife, she married a creative, so she knows how that goes too.
Well, yeah, and she comes from a family of artists and musicians.
Wow. Well, there you go.
And academics. So, yeah, it works.
So I first heard about you in your book, Man of the House, on the Eric Metaxas show. So please tell us about that book and the story behind it.
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, it's got something to do with my own background, coming from a broken home. But on a larger scale, as we look in our society, we see a lot of young men who really are at a loss when it comes to, forming households and leading them. And it has something to do with the mixed messages our culture sends. But I think the other part of it is just the simple fact that it's a hard thing to do, and people like to take the easy path. And because of that, they avoid making commitments when they don't feel like they need to, and so forth. And our society, in the old days, I can still remember this world. It's less the case now, but in the old days, there was a strong expectation for young men to do certain things. And so if you didn't do those things, you had some explaining to do. Mm. Now it's more or less, he's into that or he's not, or that kind of thing. But anyway, so in part, a lot of the trouble that men have these days, as I think about it and as I've looked at it and thought, from my own perspective, a lot of the trouble that men have these days with sort of household formation is they don't see it as it's kind of the main task that they have to perform in life. Mm. They think of it as something more or less kind of optional. If you're into that sort of thing, if you that's great. Whereas I think biblically and even just at a practical level, when men don't do what God intends for them to do in terms of establishing households and leading them in a godly way, everyone suffers, including them.
That is so true.
So the book is intended to be a real practical guide to, the sort of the nuts and bolts, sort of the, a lot of times, you get a really nice book written from a pastor or a psychologist that deals with sort of the emotional side of family life, or, right, nurturing children and stuff like that. And that's all great. I've got nothing against that. But those are not the things that men really excel at. And
I know I don't.
Yeah. And those weren't the things that in the old days, and I'm thinking hundreds of years into the past and even thousands of years past, that were men were expected to do.
Well, let's pause on this point. It's really interesting. I was listening to Dr. Albert Mohler, and he read a book. I don't even think the book was written by a believer, but it talks about the different not hormone, but the different responses children get from the mother nurturing, and then the father, hey, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, you're okay, right, do one thing at a time, focus, drive, and how both of those come together to help form a complete child in those formative years. Is that something that you've noticed as well?
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. I think that's right. And I think many young men today get the idea that their job is to be mommy second class, like do everything a mommy would do except not do it as well.
Right.
So like I've even seen guys who, when their toddler is crying and the toddler wants mommy, it's like their feelings are hurt. I'm like, what?
Oh, man.
Don't understand as a man that you bring things to the child that the woman can't bring, and the woman brings things to the child that you can't bring, and that this moment she's the one who has what the child needs. I mean, now we have this sort of weird thing where men are, evaluating their fatherhood based on how nurturing they are, rather than, and that's of course something that men can do, and it's important that they do, but that's
for sure.
Not really the thing that men bring to a child that only they can bring. And so that's kind of the thing I'm thinking about. What do I bring to the child's life that my wife can't bring, and God has given me the ability to bring?
That's a perfect segue into this next question. So it's kind of a general question. How important are fathers to the family unit, and why is there this connection between fatherlessness and the downfall of not only children but communities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we see the effects around us everywhere.
Sure.
One of the things that I wonder about when I see these shootings with mass shootings, places like Las Vegas or here in Newtown, Connecticut, is where's the father in these situations?
That's
now.
Right.
Sometimes these people are grown, but sometimes they're just teenagers or are young men in their 20s, and it's conspicuous in my mind how the media more or less skips over the question or doesn't think to ask it, or maybe doesn't want to know. But when you dig into it a little bit, you almost always see that either the father wasn't there or he was a really bad guy.
That's true. So true.
And so what I think we do is, evident there in those terrible events. It's not so much that guns kill people so much as it is young men with absent fathers with guns kill people. And I think that there are other effects, we see them with young women and sexual promiscuity, and there are just a number of negative consequences that accrue when fathers aren't present.
That's a good point. I grew up with my mother up until third grade. My parents were never married, and in third grade, my dad took over. His dad said, "Go get that boy, go get that boy," and I'm so happy for my grandfather. But just on the point you were making, my dad always said these few words. He says, "Chris, don't let your mind get blown." But what he was saying really is, Chris, keep your cool under pressure, and applying it biblically. He didn't really bring me up, reading the Bible to me, but when I became a Christian several years ago, and I started to understand the searing of the conscience, that's basically what he was saying. Don't let it get to a point to where you become one of these fatherless guys with a gun shooting people.
Right. Yeah, that was great that your father did that. I think one of the ways that fathers, perform their work with children is what your father did. It was, showing you the importance of self-control.
Yes.
Expecting certain things of you in terms of behavior. That's, the implication was that would not be acceptable for you to lose your cool. You need to exercise self-control, and in the process, what he's doing, or what he did was he said, if you want my respect, son, this is how you get it. If you want to lose my respect, that's how you lose it.
Oh, wow.
And I think that's one of the things that we as fathers can do for our children is provide standards, because there's always going to be a sense in which our fathers are a little more distant than our mothers are.
That's right.
Because mothers, of course, have that strong emotional connection, and that's valuable. It's very important. But I think fathers are always a little more distant, and because of that, and this is where I think we misunderstand the nature of fatherhood. Because of that distance, they can do things, and fathers are a little scary, and that's a good thing too.
It is a good thing,
So like when I said, people would ask me, what do my children think about this? Well, I'd say, well, they're scared of me. And I'd say, that's good. I mean, I'm not scared in the sense that they're afraid I'm going to beat them or things
sure.
like that. But in a healthy way, in the sense that they care about my opinion. They know that I can cut them off.
Right.
Those sorts of things. And what that does is that provides like a very firm standard for a child. So a child knows, okay, there are things that are just not acceptable. And you can't manipulate. Like with moms, you can kind of manipulate them sometimes. And moms, by the way, tend to manipulate you too.
Yep.
There's kind of emotional thing going on. But a father, will say things like, boy, I brought you into this world and I'll take you out. And it's true.
That's right.
Now, my sons are grown and they're bigger and stronger than me now. So I'm sort of riding on, my momentum.
Well, you establish early, and that's in the back of their mind. Like, hey, I'm bigger and stronger than Dad physically, but that's still Dad.
Right. And of course, at this point, there's love and respect, and and they're healthy. I mean, they're young men who have got their act together. So, I don't need to do a lot.
You will love this. The boxer Roy Jones Jr. Sorry about that, but his dad was the type of dad who was physically imposing, would beat him up, but wasn't the spiritual leader in the household. So by the time Roy Jones became an accomplished boxer, his dad had nothing for him. It ceased to be a father-son
Yeah,
relationship.
right. Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah, anything good can go bad,
Right.
and things go bad in particular ways, and fathers go bad in certain ways, mothers go bad in different ways. Um, so, like, this boxer's father, went bad in a particular way that's characteristic of men. But just because he went bad doesn't mean everything that he was about was absolutely bad. There were some
Sure,
things
sure.
about those that were good. Yeah.
So what's your message for mothers?
Well, I generally speaking, in my experience, most of the moms are doing pretty good. I try to encourage mothers. I try to, particularly when it comes to raising boys, give them hope, particularly if the boys are going through difficulty. Um, Sometimes these women can despair, particularly if they're on their own.
Right.
And then I try to work with fathers and husbands, because when men are doing their job, it makes mom's job a lot easier. So I don't, I get that question a lot, and it's not because I don't think mothers have a lot to do, that I don't have a whole lot to say. It's basically because I just have felt like, okay, my job is kind of focus on the guys because that's what I bring to the table.
Yeah.
So for moms, God bless you. I'm praying for you. Hope the best, and hope that you've got some men in your life that you can get some help from.
Certainly. So this approach and mindset of the Christian father is a foreign concept in our world, and unfortunately in some areas of the visible church. But besides your books, how do you tell men and married couples about fatherhood and family in this light, a biblical light?
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, I've got a lot of men in my church. In
Right.
fact, my church is probably 50-50 male-female, which is kind of unusual in our
That
world
is
today.
rare. That's rare. Yeah.
So I get together with the guys a lot. So in a typical week, I take one or two guys out to lunch, and we
Very
just
good.
talk stuff, what's going on in life. And every situation is particular to itself. So you're dealing with different things based on what a guy's going through. Some guys are strong in certain areas and weak in others, and vice versa. I try to get connected with the guys and pray for them, and kind of know the challenges that they're facing. And then when I deal with premarital counseling and so forth, basically the message sort of the heart of what I tell them is every marriage tells a story.
Mm.
And what's the story of your marriage? Now, most people think that the story of marriage is them. So, like, this is here. I'm in this for what I get out of it.
Right.
You know,
Right.
a guy will say, "I'm in it for he may not say it this plainly, but I'm in it for the sex, and I'm in it for the food,
Right.
and these kind of things." And then the woman might say, "Well, I'm in it for having a man in the house to help out with this or that, whatever." But or I'm in it for the friendship or whatever. So my comeback to them is to say, so your marriage is all about you,
Mm.
not even as a couple, but about yourselves and what you get out of it. Well, I predict that there are going to be lots of things that are going to happen that are going to give you some reasons to break it up at some point, because it's all about you. But if your story is about the gospel, then that means that you enter into it with a pattern that's biblical.
Yes.
So I take them to Ephesians chapter 5 and 6, and I say, okay, here's the way a marriage tells the gospel story. There's a role for the man, Christ. There's a role for the wife, the church. And what you do in terms of your interactions with each other illustrate the gospel. So, of course, if Christ is our example as fathers and husbands, well, that's a pretty high standard.
Yes.
You have to meet.
Wow. So we're on with Christopher C.R. Wiley on the Chris Craft Show. Let's take a little pivot here. So you write some science fiction as well. So take us into the mind of a Christian science fiction writer. What makes you tick, and what inspires your writing on that side?
Yeah, actually, I do fantasy primarily, although I have written some science fiction short stories.
Okay.
So I've got a young adult book coming out in a couple of weeks, and so it's part of a 4-book series, so it'll be 1 book a year. But to be honest with you, it's just because I like it.
Sure.
So years ago, I had this idea for a story, and in a way, it's kind of funny because English was probably it was one of the worst subjects for me as a kid in school. I didn't care for it, and it was only later when I found myself given some opportunities to write that I discovered that people actually enjoyed things I wrote. And so I did a lot of nonfiction stuff, but then I decided I'd like to try to tackle a story because I enjoyed telling stories, verbally as a preacher and so forth. I thought, well, let me try my hand at a novel, and I also took up short story form and enjoyed doing that. And it was a real learning curve because learning how to write fiction is challenging, and it's a whole different world than writing, nonfiction stuff for magazines and writing nonfiction books. But as a Christian, I strive to just tell stories that are appealing, but as a Christian, if you understand. So in other words, I don't necessarily say, oh, okay, I'm going to write a story that illustrates this or that from the Bible or whatever.
Right.
But what happens is, because I'm a Christian, a lot of that stuff gets into the stories, because I really do believe that the gospel is a picture of the way that reality works. So if I'm going to tell a story, I'm going to tell it in a way that I think is the way the world works. And because I believe that the world is full of spiritual meaning, and because I believe in a God, and because I believe that Christ, through his sacrifice, atoned for our sins, and through him we have eternal life, because I really do believe all those things are the case, then the stories I tell are full of that kind of stuff. So let's put it this way. If I was an atheist, my stories would be depressing. That's the way it is. You take a look at Kafka. You look at Kafka's, Metamorphosis. There's a guy who wakes up one day and he's a bug. And how does the story end? He gets crushed.
Oh, man.
Because he's a bug. And that's the way, Sartre and all those guys who are atheists who write fiction, that's the way their stories always go. In fact, they think if a story has a happy ending, it's naive.
Wow.
And foolish. And so one of the things I say to people is that Christians are the people who are the only people who can really write a story with a happy ending, because we really do believe it's possible to live happily ever after.
Come on now. Come on.
If you don't believe in the resurrection, you can't say that. Everybody's dead in the end. If you look at like Greek, Greek theater, you've got basically comedy and tragedy. You might remember that from high school.
From high school, yeah.
Now, in a comedy, everybody looks like a fool in a Greek comedy. Basically, what it's showing you is how foolish we are. And so even in a Greek comedy, it's kind of depressing.
Yep.
And in a tragedy, everybody's dead.
Oh, man.
At the end. And usually they're dead because of all the foolish stuff they did, So, and at the end of a Greek tragedy, everybody's either dead on stage or a laughingstock. But with the gospel, what you have is redemption and eternal life and glorification. And so, like, when you look at the end of a book, like, and I'm going to use a couple of stories that I think lots of Christians know about. If you look at, like, the Chronicles of Narnia,
right,
and you look the last book, the last battle, how does it end? Well, all of the characters who are redeemed are glorified and transformed, and really do live happily ever after. So, because now that doesn't mean that when you write a story you don't have tragic elements in the story and evil and pain and so forth, because those things are also true and
Sure.
true to life. But a Christian, when he or she writes, has an advantage, because we really do believe that happiness is not an illusion, that it is something that's ours as Christians and something to look forward to.
Wow, I love that answer. That's great. You mentioned the Daily Rituals book. Do you have the author for that title so I can include that in the show notes?
Let me do a quick search here. I can't remember the guy's name, but it won't be hard to find.
Okay, you can search for that. You are a bold brother, because I'm working on my third nonfiction title, and I have this big book by Robert McKee called Story on my shelf that I tried to tackle as one of these days or years to maybe think about doing some fiction. So
Great.
I'll definitely read your stuff and use that as inspiration. And of course, pray.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm glad to hear it. The book Daily Rituals, the subtitle is How Artists Work, and it's by a guy named Mason Curry.
Mason Curry.
Yeah, and then Currey.
EY. Okay, got it. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Sure.
So speaking of rituals, what's yours? What's your writing process? And you already kind of talked about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, but what is your daily ritual?
Yeah, well, I generally get up at 5 in the morning, and when you get older, that's not really all that impressive. You can't sleep anyway, so you get up, and then I go down and make a pot of coffee. If it's wintertime, I make a fire in the wood stove. If it's summertime, I go out on the front porch, and I get the Wall Street Journal, so I give that a quick once over, maybe read 2 or 3 things. And then usually I'm primed at that point to write.
There you go.
And depending on what I'm working on, one day a week I got to write it. I got to do my sermon. So that's then I write that generally on Wednesdays, and then the rest of the week I'm refining it. But other days I'm working either on a book or an article or a blog post. It all depends on what's calling to me.
Sure.
So that gives, and then I work straight up till noontime. I don't eat before noon. I've noticed that my blood can either be in my stomach or my brain, and so I prefer to have it in my brain when I'm working on writing.
That's interesting. And most of your book projects, they're with publishers. You're not self-publishing, right?
Right. Yeah. My fiction is with Canon Press, and my nonfiction's with Whiff and Stock. But I've had other stuff published by other publishers. But and then I write for magazines and online publications and stuff.
Really cool. Really, really cool. And I know most good writers are usually big readers. So outside of the Wall Street Journal, what are you reading these days?
Well, I've got a lot of journals and magazines. I'm a big fan of Touchstone magazine, and I've written for them, and First Things, which is kind of a middle brow public affairs journal for Christians and academics. And I sent a proposal, and they asked me to send a proposal in here last week to write about men and stuff like that. So I might write something for them. It all depends. Then I'm working on my way through a book by a woman named Holly Ordway right now called Christian Apologetics and the Imagination. And it actually gets into some of the stuff we talked about a minute ago about fiction and truth and stuff like that. Mm. And she's a believer. She teaches down, I think, at Houston Baptist College. I think that's where she is.
Yeah.
And I've got like 24 half-read books, kind of laying around. So I'll pick them up. Like there's a guy I like
I'm the
who's a
same
friend of
way.
a guy named Bill Kaufman. He writes for Front Porch Republic and for other things, and he's got a book entitled "Poetry at the Ballpark," which is a series of his essays, and it's hilarious. He's a funny guy. So I read some of that on occasion. Just all depends on what suits my fancy at the moment.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Really cool, really cool. So, a little bit of a curveball here. It's really interesting your involvement with real estate because part of what I do for a living, I help real estate professionals with branding and marketing. So, how did you get interested in real estate, and are you still doing commercial, or are you focusing more on the residential side?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. It's a lot of fun. I I bought my first two family back in 1994, and I bought it initially just because I needed a place to live. Yeah, but I like the idea of owning a property in which I could live in one unit and enjoy some rental income from the other unit.
Right.
And so that's what got me into it. And because I have a background in construction, I worked as a framer in seminary when I was working on my first master's degree. So, I've got a background in the trades. And so fixer-uppers never scare me. I enjoy them and enjoy getting into them. So that's how I got into it. And because of all the tax advantages and the income, that I got from it and appreciation, I said, hey, this is pretty good. I'll do some more of this. And 94 was a great time to get in because it was before all of the big run up, So I'm going to tell you a couple of figures that are going to just blow your mind in terms of dollars and cents. And it's a different world now. But this was in Boston.
Okay.
This was 1994. I bought a two-family for $135,000.
Say what? What?
That world is long gone.
Oh my goodness.
That place is probably worth 600 to 700,000 right now.
Wow.
That's one of the ones I wish I held on to.
That was going to be our next question.
That's right. Yeah. So from there, I lived on Cape Cod. I bought a house down there again for $136,000 that today is worth about $700,000. But I fixed that up, and so I had some equity to work with, and it was during a period of about a 5 to 7 year span that I built up my portfolio. I ended up with 18 rental units.
Oh wow.
And I had people, and I had property in 3 different states, and I had people working with me. And this was all before the big crash. And so I was transitioning out of a church. I had been in one church, and I had left that church, but I didn't have another church to go to yet. And I just decided, well, I'm going to live off of my income from my real estate and help other people who are interested in either getting in or getting out. And this was back in 2004, and we could see things that were coming along with regard to the craziness and the mortgage crisis. So by around 2005, 2006, I was the guy who was warning everybody to get out of the market, to sell their portfolios. And so I became in my area like the number one small holder realtor, a guy who dealt with people who own maybe 3 to 10 investment properties. So I was working with those folks, helping them get out. And I did that up until 2008. And that's when I was called to be the pastor of the church I'm at now. So wow. I got rid of all my stuff. And when the crash came, I bought a two-family in foreclosure, and since then I bought a second one. So I've got a couple of two families now.
There you go. Wow, what a story. It's really neat.
That's how it happened.
Wow, it's really neat. Well, Chris, I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. Your story is amazing. I'm happy to see how the painful things from your childhood, how the Lord used them to make you the strong man of God that you are today. And I'll be praying for you and your family, all the best, and for your church family as well. And I want the listeners to be able to read your stuff and to learn more about you as well. So along with publishing this episode, I would love for you to tell me where our listeners can find out more about you online.
Sure, that's easy. Just go to crwiley.com and you'll see my books there and some interviews. And when you post this, I'll post it, a link to that there. And but that's the easy way to connect with what I'm working on.
Praise God. Well, thank you so much. When you have a book coming out, we'll have to get you back onto the show.
Hey, that'd be great. Thank you very much, Chris. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, thank you, and God bless.
You too.
If you enjoyed today's show, please give us a 5-star review and subscribe on iTunes. I'd be ever so grateful. Contact the show anytime via email with your questions, comments, ideas, and prayer requests at love@chriscraftshow.com. That's LOVE@chriscraftshow.com. Or you can leave us a voicemail at 855-932-7263. Please indicate if you like your email or voicemail read or played during the show. And remember, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. God bless.